Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And today we are going to be discussing what we had announced last week, which is localism, and the topic is acting local while thinking global. Now, we have talked about many and various local solutions, people that are creating projects on permaculture and local ways to create communities that are self-sustainable. And this way of counteracting the major system that we have and the economy as a capitalist system. But many times we have kind of pondered, well, is there a way to reconcile the localist movement to create greater changes at a system level, and particularly considering that we are living in a capitalist system? So is there a way to make both ends meet at some point? And to discuss this, we have invited Alex Razo. He's from the UK and currently living in Portugal. So hi, Alex, welcome to the Hangout.
Hello, hi, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. And to explain to our viewers, we are going to be discussing this topic that emerged from reading the book No Local by Greg Sharzer. And this book came up as some kind of interesting way of looking at localism. So I decided that it would be great to discuss it with Alex because he had been in a previous Hangout discussing with us about permaculture. So to him, it was also very cool to hear this, read this perspective by Greg. And so we will be touching upon certain topics from the book, but more so, we will also be discussing his personal experience and perspective, him having been part of this local movement, specifically on the permaculture side, and what he has learned from the book and his perspective on the main topic of the book, which is what we will begin discussing. First of all, I remind you, the viewer, that there is questions, comments available. We have one already, so I will just address it very quickly by WG Grainer. He's saying, why is there no basic income in Europe instead of banking crisis 2008, etc.? Well, thanks for your question. We usually address basic income subjects. Today we're talking about more on localism and holism and this perspective, but as a simple idea, it is because we, the people, and of course people in Europe, haven't organized precisely in a political manner to make of basic income not only a petition from my perspective, but an actual way to organize ourselves and to govern ourselves, to give money to each other as a living right. We have various subjects on Hangouts on that subject, so I would invite you to go to our YouTube channel, Living Income, and just make a research, because we made actually a Hangout on the European Basic Income petition, so you're welcome to watch that one, and the various other European Basic Income movements, including political parties and people that are organizing themselves there. Okay, so having said that, thanks for your question. So let's get on with the actual topic. So, No Local, this book. First of all, what is like the main thesis of the book from your perspective, Alex?
Well, I've just noticed that there's a bit of a lag that I'm actually watching here on the screen, so I apologize to anyone in advance for that. There's going to be a bit of a pause, but just bear with me and hopefully we'll overcome that. If I can just show you the cover of the book here, the subtitle of the book is Why Small-Scale Alternatives Won't Change the World. So in a sense, the basic premise of this book is looking at various forms and manifestations of localism and localist ideology and philosophy, and contrasting it with capitalism, specifically global capitalism, which is what we are now all living in, from essentially a Marxist perspective. Greg Sharzer is a PhD student in Marxist theory, among other things, and so he's written this book in a way as a critique of those kind of localist movements, but also as a way of looking at how they could better apply those philosophies within the context of global capitalism.
So in essence, we get to read in this book many concepts and that kind of define localism as the new forms of utopia and the petite bourgeoisie that are trying to make these solutions here and there, but that have no effect on the entirety of the system. So first of all, why is it that localism in itself has become like this epitome or this idea of being a liberating movement in contrast to the current capitalist system? What's your perspective on that?
Well, it's interesting. Perhaps there's a really interesting quote that actually I agree with, and it's quite interesting about localism from the book itself, if that's okay. It says, okay, so some might say localism might not change everything, but at least it's doing something. And in fact, the whole point of being a locavore is that it's not trying to bring down global systems. Localism makes small, incremental changes within our reach. If the net result is that the world is fairer and greener, so much the better. If it's not, no one gets hurt, and maybe we get a few good crops of tomatoes out of it. In that sense, localism is a kind of pluralism. You build your big social movements over there, we'll set up our farmers' markets over here, and sooner or later, the two will end up. We don't have to choose between the two. So in that sense, you know, it kind of describes as well as much the kind of conventional definition of localism, which is really having a preference, personal preference for your own area, your own region, or whatever your kind of locality may be, over the world or over a global view. And the kind of common definition of localism is exactly that. And it actually describes that action, essentially having a limitation, creating a limitation on outlook. So this is really one of the points that Greg Sharzer in his book is addressing, is the fact that a solely local focus is potentially doing that. It's actually limiting our outlook, and in a sense can prevent us from seeing the global implications of our actions. Does that make sense?
Yes, what I liked about this perspective is precisely that we tend to fall short when we only consider these alternative solutions without looking at the greater picture, which is like the main tenet of this book from my perspective, and how, as you were mentioning, reading from the book, it is good. I mean, as we talked in the Permaculture Hangout, in terms of having this kind of knowledge, awareness of doing it yourself and having that food sovereignty process, that is available for some people. But if we look at it as a genuine solution, I mean, we were looking at, do poor people have the ability to grow their own food? What's your perspective on this?
Oh yeah, that one of that was one of the passages in the preface of the book, and it's that really struck me, because from my own perspective, as someone who is kind of, despite my own personal economic circumstances, essentially in terms of my upbringing, you could middle class. So I do represent what people like Karl Marx would refer to as the petite bourgeoisie. So it's people in the middle strata of society who, by their relative level of social mobility and economic mobility, have the luxury of opportunity to be able to consider alternatives, because they're not constantly faced with the necessity of survival as people who are living in poorer circumstances, working people as we would find it may be. Yeah, it's sorry, they're long questions, so I sometimes lose my thread with where we're going. So yeah, so it's Sorry, can you come back to the point that you were getting at again? It helps me to focus.
Yeah, like how poor people don't have that time to maybe grow their own food. I mean, they're already working like 12 hours, maybe 2 jobs at a time, and still this idea of growing your food or doing some community work is seen as something liberating. But do these people have the time for it? My perspective is that obviously they don't. So why is this being called out as a liberating process, and whether this benefit the system in any way?
Well, as far as people are concerned, you're absolutely right. It's just that often they don't have the time to either consider or take on that extra burden on top of all of the time that they have to spend working simply to get the money to live, to exist, to survive. Just after that quote, that example in the preface of the book, Greg Sharzer says, when you're poor, time and energy aren't the only things to go. The first is dignity, as you're forced to scrape by on less. And increasingly in the world today, we are seeing more and more people having to get by with less and less. And so in a sense, you know, the middle class, with that luxury of time, more time certainly, and more economic mobility, you know, kind of suggesting that this be an option for everybody is really naive. You know, it's a little bit of a kind of naive assumption, and it really demonstrates the kind of disjoint between those two strata of our current society, really.
I agree on that. And I mean, also another aspect was coming from the perspective of promoting solutions that are coming from the ground up as a systemic change that we promote or begin with the provision of a living income. I was surprised that there is no mention of that, like how to empower people directly by giving them money, and instead it is directly assumed through these forms of resistances. So why don't we look at some of those which are spoken of as you know, movements on permaculture and communities that are becoming self-sustainable and do-it-yourselfist, and this kind of I would call it a little bit of the effort that people have, and it is very well known and recognized as well, to create change. But does it go political enough? Is it political enough to effect wider changes?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, looking at permaculture initially, it is, you know, a growing movement, let's say, literally. It's in that sense, it takes a kind of organic perspective and looks at ways of doing things which are essentially moving at what is perceived to be nature's pace. So slowly, carefully, and you know, taking time, and certainly there is some value in that for the individual human being in having certain realizations of their own nature as a human being, as a form of life. However, in contrast, capitalism moves very fast, very efficiently, even regardless of the human, social, and environmental cost that is incurred as a result of that drive for efficiency. So, yeah, I mean, particularly taking permaculture as an example, but you know, other localist approaches as well. They focus on doing things in small ways and do them slowly, and hoping that that will ultimately, over a long time, create a critical mass. However, in the current system that we live in, with this kind of all-encompassing, all-infiltrating, overarching system of global capitalism, we can see the changes that it is implementing and forcing, literally forcing by the very nature of what it is and what it is only capable of being, is happening very quickly, really, really quickly, and with ever more dire and detrimental effects. And so ultimately, the problem localist and small scale attempts to bring about change are faced with the fact that they're working in a sense against, whether that's from a perspective of resistance or simply just in recognition, or in sometimes not, almost an ignorance and denial of something, a force really beyond that now anybody's control, which is incredibly weighted, carries huge resources at its disposal, both physical resources, money, human resources, everything else, which it can use through its mechanism of exploitation to drive that engine literally over any attempt to change it that is happening in a small way. So it's a scale, really. You know, it's a question of just the massive disparity between the ratio there of those things and what change they can affect, both in terms of the size, the geographical scale, and in terms of time as well.
So could we say that localism actually has the capacity to change the capitalist ways? Because what you're mentioning is that it is a relatively small scale in comparison to the overarching capitalist system that we have. And here I would like to look at what can we learn from what localists have realized in terms of the change of lifestyles, and how we are currently, as you were mentioning, bombarded with this idea lifestyle of, as Greg Sharzer says, our greed and desire for gain will lead us to our complete destruction, which is kind of like the outflows of the current capitalist system. So what aspects that you've also realized from yourself as a person that has practiced permaculture, what can we learn of that lifestyle and change of mentality and realizations that, if reaching that critical mass is possible, as you were mentioning, could affect the way that we, each one of us in the system, can affect a greater change?
Okay, cool question. Well, the simple answer, the short answer is a lot. Learn a lot from that. To expand upon that a little bit, it seems certainly from reading the book and to a certain extent through some of my observations, that a lot of localists have realized, whether they're doing permaculture in isolated or relatively isolated rural situations, or practicing, trying to forward agriculture problem, rather urban agriculture projects as a way of addressing the inability of working class people and poor people in urban environments to get access to healthy food, or whether we're talking about small scaleized alternative currencies. A lot of the people participating within these movements seem to have realized that they are still, regardless of the good intentions, regardless of the obvious merits of what they're doing, that they are up against forces which have no conscience ultimately, because, as I say, capitalism now may once kind of driven and controlled by human beings, has now become something over which no human beings actually have control. It has taken on a life force of its own, and it is devouring resources, dignity, everything effectively in the world at such a rate that none of these local movements can really keep up, and consequently they have to face the fact that at some point they are going to be confronted by this immense global capitalist force. So yeah, it's a great challenge. There is definitely, it seems, value in focusing on what we can do in our immediate environment. That definitely is something valuable, and it also it's something that recognizes the fundamental fact that each of us is in a particular place, experiencing to some extent unique local conditions, whether that be the local watershed, what the land will and is able to provide to grow, and the potential diversity of that compared to other places, the economic conditions in a particular place, the social and cultural conditions, and historical as well. However, when we focus solely on that, we can potentially perhaps lose sight of those conditions and forces which we all have in common, and which are in perhaps slightly different ways affecting us all commonly. So in that sense, hopefully I'm still answering the question accurately here, but yeah, it's really a question of how these local movements, if not just keeping an eye on the world at large, but also actually making it an essential component of their particular success to develop a really keen insight and understanding of and into capitalism itself. Whether we're looking at that from the, you know, the kind of cliched sort of expression of know your enemy, or just simply understanding the world and the system in which we live, so as better to develop solutions that are able to respond to that effectively. Ultimately, if we're trying to, say for example, hypothetically, fix a car with no basic understanding of the mechanics of the car itself, then we are effectively screwed. We're not going to be able to achieve anything. So it's actually about, I think, a lot of localist movements perhaps in the past have begun with a kind of maybe a very, very basic and perhaps sometimes even misguided understanding of what capitalism is, how it functions. And based on that, simply putting that out of mind in order to then focus on alternatives. And you mentioned utopianism and a utopian kind of view. And, you know, and perspective, utopianism is about vision. And in some cases, about one person's vision, which if they are charismatic enough, drive and bring together and coalesce enough people behind that one person's vision and philosophy, which, while that person is alive, enough to sustain that movement. But unfortunately, that kind of utopian vision in itself isn't always, as I say, really based on a practical and in-depth understanding of the forces that are actually at work in the world, whether they're economic, social, political, or otherwise.
Yeah, we've also discussed how to create changes, in fact, in the system, we are aiming at the political changes. And actually, Greg finishes his book with that, isn't it? Talking about reforms. So can you tell us a little bit more on this?
Yeah, well, there is an interesting passage on the last page, really, more or less, of the book. And it says, the localist future isn't a bad place to be, but understanding how we get there imposes some capital-centric restrictions. How capital must expand and centralize at any cost, and how the system must ultimately be ended if that process is to stop. The people who resist need social movements that build their political capacities. The social anarchist Bookchin, describing libertarian municipalism, calls for the development of serious organizations, a radical politics, a committed social movement, theoretical coherence, and programmatic relevance. So within that, we can see that really what Greg is saying is that local movements on their own are insufficient in building a capacity of people sufficient to create any kind of critical mass in terms of the 7 billion beings on the planet. I mean, even the critical mass of 10 or 15% is still a really, really large number of people. And it's very, very difficult to get that many people behind local ideologies which only address and are focused on local conditions. Ultimately, particularly nowadays, when we have the technology through internet, through social media as well, and the power and potential cannot be underestimated in its potential to actually pull people together, not just from the perspective of having one person as a kind of charismatic figurehead, whether that be Senor Sanchez Gordillo, mayor of Marlen, which I can mention in a minute, or somebody like Russell Brand, to get behind that and almost rely on the charisma of that one individual. But more than that, to actually cut through and see through the solely localized conditions of any particular movement or struggle, to see the economic and social and political forces that are actually underpinning having an effect on all human beings right across the world, whatever country, on whatever strata of society, whether you are, you know, capitalist, CEO of a corporation, whether you are a middle class, petite bourgeoisie, going off into Portugal in some beautiful little Shangri-La and creating a space that is a perfect kind of utopian bubble wherein you can grow vegetables and you listen to the birds and really almost forget that the grind and the struggle and the absolute turmoil of, you know, life, which has been the sort of become the symbol of sort of capitalist aspiration in terms of what it is achieving and making happen conditions that it for so many human beings, really. Or, you know, whether you are I don't know, whether you are, you know, creating some sort of localized urban, you know, local alternative currency or something like that. If we can't get past the localism of that and the locus of that, then it's impossible for us to actually get to the common things that any human being, no matter what their circumstances, can identify with, and therefore can appreciate. And that on those grounds alone must be enough to get, if not consensus, then consent and support and practical participation and direct action of that number of human beings necessary to create that critical mass, which in turn, as apparently been proven, will move the whole of human society around the world in a direction.
In this, I would also like to see the point of social responsibility, and how no matter if you're like enclosed or off the grid or apparently in a self-sustainable community, just by the fact that we live in the same world, we are all affected by the same physical laws and the same economic principles and these processes of abuse that exist, and that we cannot really say, oh, I'm out of it and I'm creating solutions here for my community or only my family. From our perspective also, as the principles that we promote, social responsibility implies I am a member of this world, not only of a nation even, and we then have that moral responsibility to create solutions that can apply to everyone. And that's why we see, for example, the provision of a living income as something that can apply to everyone, because we're talking about money. And if we all agree that money can be given as a solution, so that no matter where you are or what kind of practice, a locavore or a foodist or a person working in Wall Street, you will still be part of the same system and looking at that like global type of solutions. But why hasn't this been considered before? I will tell you my perspective is that there is some kind of moral aspect, or I would say more of a feel-good aspect to saying I am doing something and I am seeing the results from it, because you have something so direct, such as growing your own food. But when you look at the changes in the system, of course, they will take time. And we're talking about changes in education and changes in the way that we consume and what we value, how we value things, how our money is created. All of these changes, I would see that we can learn from what localists and people in these kind of alternative movements have already realized for themselves. So what I would say is that what we require is them to kind of reinsert themselves back into the system and say, look, we've learned this, why don't we make this practices and this understanding and this changing lifestyle something like a new culture that considers not only the mainstream capitalists consume the most and buy the cheapest because that is destroying the earth, and rather integrate some of the localist practices and methods and ways and philosophy even to the mainstream. Would you say that this is possible?
Yes. In fact, it's only possible. It's absolutely essential for people within such localist movements, whether it's permaculture or any other, to think that simply by doing their own little thing, and and I have met myself, many people who say, I don't like the way the world system is, and therefore want to step out of it. And in doing so, I am making a change and making a statement, and that statement stands as a shining example to all human beings that they're the same. And it's not only is it just really a kind of naivety and really, attempt for individuals to absolve themselves of that responsibility and that moral imperative, because these are often intelligent people, and so for them to plead ignorance in that situation is frankly insulting to everyone else in the world who is still left picking up the slack for the demands of capitalism on behalf of all of those people who have chosen to catch and step out of the system because they don't want to participate. It does no good for people to go into, to detach themselves from society and pretend that they can play some kind of game of sort of Schrodinger's cat world, and pretend that just because they can't see something, it's not there, it goes away. I mean, that's really the height of naivety. And as I say, if people who are doing this have some intelligence, I've met people who have kind of PhDs and degrees in ecology and environmental science and things like that. So they're not dumb, they're not ignorant. And so that excuse is absolutely unsupportable from my perspective. It's just a denial of responsibility. And ultimately, whether on the surface we might be seeing some kind of what can I say, sort of from an ego perspective, self-supportive sort of action in that respect, a feel-good kind of inspiration, it's actually coming from a point of fear as its origin.
Why would you say so? Because I was also getting at that from a perspective of how also Greg Sharzer says that there can be some kind of pessimism in people that only focus on the local solutions. Pessimism from the perspective that it is too big to do some major changes in the system at large, and it is seen as impossible. So instead of attempting to change it, rather kind of step outside of it and make your own ways and methods outside of it. But as we've been mentioning, you cannot really be outside of it. So what would you say on this?
You're absolutely right. And there is definitely a sense of pessimism there. When you talk to people often who live in wonderful situations or are trying to achieve, some really interesting things on a local scale in response to perceived local conditions and circumstances, there is a sense of pessimism amongst many people when you ask them to talk about and look at the global system, the global picture and its impacts and implications. But I think it's important to note also that it isn't just pessimism. There is an element of cynicism as well, perhaps if we were to discard the kind of ignorance of the mechanics of capitalism for a moment and say that to a certain extent we have no use but to not be able to find out how capitalism works. There is plenty of information out there, such as this book, local, which I would recommend anybody who's involved in localist or localized movements to read as soon as possible, because that's cynicism. If I take the example of, say, farmers markets, okay, so we have organically grown produce which is ethically produced, and it can only be sustained ultimately in competition with capitalist big agriculture, ultimately, let's say industrial agriculture, which is able to produce food for people, be it healthy or organic, clean or not, with ever greater efficiency and at ever decreasing costs to the consumer, drive down prices all the time, I mean, or compete with other corporations that are trying to do the same. That localized aspect of the farmers market can only continue to exist while it is prepared to demand that consumers pay a higher price for what they are actually offering, based kind of let's say not necessarily soundly founded moral or ethical philosophy. Does that make sense?
I get the point that also when we talk about what every single local solution is still influenced by, there is like let's say a collective ignorance of why should we create these alternatives as alternative when we could make it a mainstream as part of the system, like instead of having farmers markets to only have that as the main way to get our food, and as he mentions, to create these local relationships and make it a place to get together. I mean, that sense of localism is really cool. I really like the idea of being able to build bonds with our neighbors, because all of that is lost in our cities and all of that. But instead of making it like these small solutions, why don't we make it part of the new way that capitalism works? And we will get to that aspect of whether localism can perfect capitalism in any way, or are they mutually exclusive. But before we get to that, we have some questions from Andrea Thiel, and she's saying, does the author say that maybe it is not an either or, that we can act locally by being an example and participate on a system level, educating people about how it really works to the detriment of all life, and come up with solutions for the whole?
Right. Well, thank you, Andrea. That's a really interesting question. From my perspective, the answer to that question, the author does actually acknowledge that, and in a sense, towards the end of the book, that's precisely what he's getting at, and I would agree. So, I mean, to kind of just simplify, you know, what he said by saying, yeah, that is effectively what he's getting. To share my view on that, yes, it is essential, and that is a really effective way of us approaching and ultimately changing and transforming these localized, without saying localist, but localized movements, because we have the through technology, through the internet, for example, to have a global presence, so we can communicate things that are happening on a local scale and share the successes and the failures in honesty with the rest of the world, so that they can in turn benefit from individual local people, local movements experience. And that has a benefit in the sense that they don't necessarily have to repeat the same mistakes. They can learn from that. We recently, my partner and I recently visited an eco campsite which had a permaculture cooperative attached to it, which started with a group of 50 people who put in 50 euros each, which contributed to the purchase of just under a hectare of land in a place called Sintra on the west coast of Portugal. And it's just north of Lisbon. And so they bought this bit of land, which was covered in rubbish and was basically just a sort of desolate bit of wasteland. And over a period of 7 to 8 years, they transformed this piece of land and built a cooperative in numbers, so that now the number of members, I think, exceeds about 600. And people come to the location, to the cooperative, and they're obviously members around the world as well, of which I am now one because I'm not there, who basically they can come and buy the food that's produced there. They sell the food there as a way of actually generating an income for the cooperative to sustain it, as well as providing space for this eco campsite as well. Courses in that location to educate people. Also, and this is something that I found out talking with the cooperative, who were, you know, very, very much politically aware and economically aware. The lady Isabel, who founded and sort of heads up, if you like, the cooperative from a sort of, in a sense, kind of leadership role, although as very much part of a kind of, you know, cooperative system, has a degree in philosophy, and that has very much kind of informed her decision to kind of detach from that sort of academic field and go into permaculture. But at the same time, because of that, she hasn't lost awareness that it's absolutely necessary to connect with other organizations doing similar things in other places around the world. And that is the thing that's absolutely key, is that although we can act locally, if we use the technology and the resources that we have in our modern society, you know, we don't have to go back to basics and start wearing kind of, you know, clogs and rags and, you know, using any kind of new technology. That's just a denial of the situation in the world that we're currently living, and is not serving anybody at all. We have to live in the world we are in and recognize the resources that we have at our disposal. Otherwise, ultimately, what we're saying is that we don't deserve to be in this world and to have the resources that we have and feel about using them because, oh, they contribute to capitalism, etc., etc. We have to accept our responsibility and ultimately the power that we really have as human beings to use those resources responsibly, with integrity, and with a worldview that recognizes that we can actually have an effect and an impact on a global scale if we accept and empower ourselves with that responsibility. If we accept that responsibility, we are in that act empowering ourselves and to that level of saying any human being can, any group of human beings can get together and have, if not the same power, but immeasurably more power than any corporation or any capitalist organization can have. Because if you look at it, corporations are made up of people who are, through the conditions of capitalism, forced to work for a wage, which means that they are always getting less value for the time that they put into that labor than it is actually worth. If that were not the case, then no corporation, no business could actually make a profit. Profit is created by corporations selling things for more than they've had to pay to produce them, and that includes labor. And that's how they managed to force this situation whereby people are forced to contract for a wage, which is, that's what labor is. It's actually the conditions under which you're paid less for the time that you work than it's actually worth in terms of what somebody else can gain in financial terms from.
I lost you a little bit there, but I will also want to mention that in the sense of this work coercion process, the provision of a living income would also benefit everyone, but because then you would have the actual opportunity of, maybe if you do want to join a community and do that research to then bring it back into the system and start educating people about the possibilities, that change in our mind and veered towards solutions is what is not promoted at the moment at a mainstream level, because it seems that there is almost like a plot to subsume all of us into these doomsday type of scenarios of, yes, the world is going to end up being destroyed and there's not going to be any water. And we're not focusing that much on solutions, which I see from the perspective of localism. They do focus a lot on that, and it would be very valuable that more people gather that experience, but also go back into the system, as Andrea was mentioning, to educate people about it. So thanks for your comment, Andrea. And she's also saying, by the way, thanks for being on this Hangout, Alex. It is very good to open up all points that of what we are facing as humanity. Thanks for your thoughtful thinking.
I'll just add something to that. I mean, just to reiterate slightly, yes, education is a fundamental part of what we can bring to the global situation with the technology that we have. But it's not just a question of more intelligent or educated people seeing the kind of their ability to educate those who haven't had the educational advantages that they have, because let's be honest, there's a lot of intelligent people in the world who need some serious education as well, and on all levels of society. Really, it's about an education that actually opens up an awareness of this fact, this fundamental fact of the essential interdependence and consequent interconnectedness of all life, which simply cannot be denied on a biological level. Okay, before we even kind of go down entertaining any kind of ridiculous spiritual aspect to anything, whether that's permaculture or anything else, let's keep our feet on the ground, look at sorting out practical solutions. And from that perspective, money itself is a resource that we have as human beings created. We are all part of that money system because we are all, to some degree, whether we're localists or not, dependent upon money for our survival, and we are as human beings in that respect. So if we are all collectively the creators and sustainers of money as a system by our participation within it on whatever scale and whatever level, whether we are, member of the Rothschild family who, own most of the private banks in the world, and then consequently through that the IMF and the various kind of global institutions like that, we can use that money, that resource, even though money isn't necessarily kind of equally distributed among all human beings at the moment. We have the power as human beings to in sufficient numbers to create not just ability to protest and demand, or in which is in a sense asking permission that we can bring about that change, but actually saying, no, we simply have power. We are going to move non-violently because it's not necessary, and just do that by force of numbers without any need for violence. We can simply move as one and do what needs to be done. And so we can do the same with money. We can go to the institutions, whether it be physically or metaphorically through technology, through creating awareness, and simply change them by sheer mass, literally, so that there is no option. So that because what a lot of these capitalists and even the petty bourgeoisie on level middle class people, I think, fear that actually in creating real equality, starting with the money system and being able to give a guaranteed living income that provides a dignified life for all human beings equally, that they would somehow lose out. Wouldn't. You see, all capitalists are competing with each other, right? It's about dominance. There's a wonderful passage in the book, if I can just refer to it again, although I've got rid of it somewhere. Oh no, it's under here. Okay, so let me just flick through a sec, because it really did a good description of capitalism and why it exists. Let me see if I can find that. One moment. Okay.
In the meantime, I just read Bella V's comment. She's saying, awesome point on human beings together. Here is our power. I fully agree, Bella. That's also part of what we can learn from communities that organize themselves, and how this is missed out in sort of the capitalist system that is obviously promoting only individualistic purposes. And it's time to shift the me into we, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I can't find the quote exactly off the top of my head. Sorry, I'm sort of flicking through the book, and I've earmarked some pages, but I can't find the exact quote. Yeah, essentially, it's just a question of actually, with a competent understanding of working with, we can actually find precise and through that precision, really, really effective, and in the same way as capitalism is, efficient ways of responding to what it's doing. So yeah, ultimately, as I was saying, the capitalists are competing with each other. It comes from, if we go back to where it all started, and people think that it was the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution that really started capitalism going. And if we look at, the kind of, if we Google it quickly, we see that kind of Google says that the starting point of capitalism was really the 1850s. But actually, it started in England with something called closure. And this was really the act of enclosing and effectively, in a term that we now understand, privatizing ownership of land. Prior to that point, and this really started in the 12th century, so it goes back a long way, it happened really in that basis in an informal way. And then in the 17th century, it began to be formalized, that enclosure happened, and being forced through endless, well, successive acts of parliament, of which there have been thousands really between that sort of period, you know, the 1700 up until the 20th century, where effectively what had been common land, which means that the land that was held in common and not really owned by anybody, so people could just go and use it to grow food, raise animals, to support themselves and their communities. What started to happen was that that land was taken away from people. It was no longer open access. It was literally physically enclosed so that people couldn't have access to it. And deeds of ownership were drawn up so that a legal framework started to be created. And this is the start of the whole legal framework that we have now in our world, whether we uniform commercial code or British Admiralty law or whatever. It started with this, the theft of land that was up until that point free as source that the earth provided, and as such was regarded as such, as free, as open to be accessed by all. So it started to be enclosed, and more and more land then became inaccessible to people. And you know, we have the National Trust in the UK now, and you can walk onto land where it says such and such common. It's kind of insulting, really. All that is kind of a reflection of how that land was stolen from people. And it was that really began to people away from that land that they could no longer access, and therefore was no longer available to them so that they could sustain themselves and survive, forced them into towns, forced them into the urban environment where capitalists were able to exploit that concentration of labor power and manipulate it, you know, start the whole kind of wage contract system going and force people to work for their survival. So capitalists said, look, if you want to survive, this is what I'm offering you and nothing less. This is what I'm offering you, and I guarantee you this is the best that you'll get. So if you want to survive, you live and work in these conditions and exactly as you're told, and don't complain because I've got the power to take away your income and your means of survival like that. So, you know, what we're looking at is a really kind of essentially patriarchal, you know, a sort of male mentality driven, fear driven core root of dominance, of control, which is, you know, really underpinned by a fear of scarcity, of not having a need for the need for of nature, of everything, you know, and that really does come from a point of fear. So we are dealing with something that is ultimately, even if it is now, and perhaps that's more of a concern that it's now out of anybody's control, but even as it started to, in its origin, under certain people's control, driven by a sort of brutality, I mean, really vicious brutality that ultimately had no regard for life at all. And that's why we're experiencing these conditions today. And so, yes, we are looking at ways that we can potentially transform capitalism, but we need to be realistic about what that is. So I'll stop there for the moment.
Yes, we have also gotten to the end of the Hangout. I would like to simply read one last quote from the book. It says, "The fight for reforms must have a revolutionary strategy at its heart, confronting the capitalist social relations that localism refuses to." So as a way to bring the point to a form of equality, what I would say is that people that are focusing on local solutions think global, think at the system level to affect their, also at a political level. There's also a series going on, The Politics of Self, which I suggest everyone watches because my hosts in these Hangouts are discussing precisely these subjects of how we can change our perspective of how we are socially responsible. All of us can come together, create solutions, and how that isthmus is like a change of mentality that needs to take place, which is currently what is sustaining, from my perspective, also the current capitalist system, because that involves actual work and responsibility. So those are principles that we definitely support here. So thanks a lot, Alex, for your input and your perspectives, and I'm sure that we will some other time have more.
Do I have time to share one tiny thing?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Quick observation related to that point, which is ultimately we can realize through proving it to ourselves in a 3D reality, which is kind of testing laboratory, cause and effect. We can see the effects of our actions. We can see that the more that we resist against something, the power we give to it. So rather than talking about resisting or fighting against capitalism, we can talk about working within and as the system to try to find ways to perfect it. Now, one thing that I've just noticed for myself recently, in terms of talking about perfecting something, if we're talking about from the perspective of potential absolutes, then something that can be perfected must perhaps by necessity be considered that perfection may also be its non-existence. So perhaps one of the ways that we find that we need ultimately, the ultimate way of perfecting capitalism is to, with care and compassion for life, to find ways to end it and not damage our entire planet and ecosystem and end all life in the process.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in the perspective also of there's an emerging trend of regenerative capitalism, which we will intend to also bring to a discussion here, because then it changes the whole the principles that capitalism has been founded upon. And maybe it won't be called capitalism, but it is at least adding principles, values, consideration for life on Earth, as you're saying, into the way that we live on Earth. So let's leave it at that. Thanks a lot once again.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Marlen. Much.
And thanks to you, the viewer, for watching, and keep an eye on next week for another live Hangout. Goodbye, Alex, and thanks for your time.
Goodbye. Thank you.